Welcome everyone to today's video. It's been quite a while since I've been here on YouTube, and one of the reasons is that actually in the middle of this year I sadly suffered a great loss of a very, very dear friend. And whilst I often do share from my personal life, it's rare that I go into this much level of sharing, but I thought that today what I'd like to do is to actually explain what happened this year and to explain a little bit about how my yoga practice and how the perspective of yoga has helped me through a very, very challenging time. And the reason that I'm sharing this is not because I'm seeking to garner any attention or because I'm seeking to garner any sympathy. The reason that I'm sharing this is to show that even in the most challenging and abject of circumstances, yoga provides us with a way through. Whilst it can't numb us, and it shouldn't, whilst it can't ameliorate all of the effects of the challenges that we face in the world, which of course it shouldn't either, it does absolutely help us to navigate difficult times, challenges in our lives, which we all inevitably face, and leave us in a position that although we may not be free of suffering at the lower levels of yoga, we might say, if we're not enlightened, it can definitely help to ease a path forward. And so actually, one of the things that I'm most grateful about this year is the fact that rather than the circumstances that I've lived through actually taking my faith away from yoga and feeling that perhaps somehow yoga wasn't up to the challenge, I'm actually coming to the end of this year realizing that I have even more faith in the power of yoga, not a blind faith, but a faith that has been established based on practice and seeing how practically yoga has helped me off the mat to establish some form of balance in what has been a very, very challenging year. So let's go back to June. I was sitting actually in this very spot, attending an online course, taking notes, diligently following the class, and suddenly I noticed out of the corner of my eye that my phone was ringing and various people were messaging me. And because of the intensity with which the phone was ringing, I decided to pick up the phone and just look at the messages and just write back to this particular person and say, sorry, I'm in a class, but if it's urgent, please could you message me? And they said, I can't message you, I can't leave a voice note, it's too sensitive. So I had 5 minutes left of the class, and at the end of the 5 minutes the class ended. I phoned this person, and in that moment, in this very spot, they told me that my best friend had been murdered by her partner at home and that she had sadly died. This was possibly the most shocking news I've ever received in my entire life. The immediate emotional meltdown, because I can't think of any other way of explaining it, that I had was commensurate with the shock of losing someone who had been an intrinsic part of my life since I was 16 years old. She was someone who I confided in my deepest secrets. She was someone who I looked up to, who I had great honor and respect of knowing. She was a beautiful soul, a beautiful being, and I just could not comprehend in my mind, even though I knew the challenges of her circumstances, I could not comprehend in my mind how such a thing could have happened to such a person. It's fair to say that in that moment my life changed. Of course, the lives of many other people changed, her parents, brothers, sisters, children, and so forth, many, many people affected. But in that moment, my life and all of our lives changed because we had lost someone very, very dear to us in a very, very violent and we might say cruel manner. Now, what on earth does one do in that situation when you are experiencing such deep trauma, such deep loss, such deep pain? And I can say that actually having lost both of my parents at a relatively young age, having lost aunts and uncles and so forth at different stages in my life, nothing compared to the shock of this tragic circumstance that had occurred. So at the end of that day, having been to visit friends and having been to visit her family and so forth, I came home, I sat in the garden, I took some time, I looked up at the stars, I looked at the trees in the garden, I felt the wind blowing. I felt her on the wind actually that evening. But something just told me, you need to go and lie on your mat. You need to move, you need to breathe, you need to reconnect. And even though I felt completely mentally distracted, and even though I felt that I couldn't take my mind away from the suffering and thinking about Annabelle and everything that had happened to her, and still at a very early stage of trying to comprehend this was less than 24 hours, it was less than 12 hours after having found out, I took some time on my mat, I moved, I breathed, I connected. I didn't really know why I was doing it, I didn't really know what I should be doing, but something just called me to be there. And morning and night, as I have done for the previous 10 years in my life, I got onto my mat, I did some practice. And even though at times the practice could not penetrate or even touch the depth of pain and the depth of suffering that I was feeling and the amount of tears that I was shedding on a daily basis, I just had a deep inner faith that I knew that I needed to be on my mat, and that I knew and that I felt that movement and that slowing down my breath and doing all of the things that I practice and all of the things that I've learned and many of the things that I teach to reset my nervous system was going to be invaluable to allow me to create an environment within myself that of course honoured the fact that I was deeply perturbed, deeply distraught, deeply upset, as were all of the people around me, but at the same time just practicing the ability to just slightly step back from the situation, slightly step back from the emotions, and to honour a different space within me that although it was able to witness those experiences, it was just an observer of the situation. It was not attached to the situation. It could watch things come and go and appreciate them in the moment as passing experiences. So before I go into that part in more detail, what I would like to say to start with is this, is that one of the things that I've learned this year about yoga is that yoga doesn't need to be perfect. That is to say that often we have this idea that when we get onto the mat, we need to be totally focused, we need to totally show up, we need to really be present with each and every moment. And although, of course, that is the ideal situation, what I learned this year is that even when I felt broken, even when I felt totally distracted, even when I couldn't shift some of the feelings and emotions within my body, just by going through the motions of what I'd practiced before and moving and breathing and attempting to create a shift, in some way it was valuable and helpful. And actually in the times when I felt most distraught, in the times when I shed the deepest and darkest tears that I've shed, what I did was I threw myself onto the ground and I threw myself onto my mat, even if it meant just lying on my back or lying face down onto the mat and doing something. All of it in some way helped at different levels at different times. And actually it's that thread of practice that's carried me through into this point, which in many ways has kept me balanced and in many ways has kept me sane. The important thing though to acknowledge about this is that the reason that the practice was effective at helping me to step back and to detach to a certain degree was the fact that I had a samskara, a pattern of practice that had been developed over the previous 10 years of regular daily practice. I often say this in sessions that it's important that we practice yoga in peacetime so that we can meet the times of challenge with a pattern that is already established in knowing how to connect to our body, knowing how to calm our breath, knowing how that feels internally, and knowing what peace feels like on the inside. If we don't know that feeling, then when we get into traumatizing situations or situations that are beyond the everyday boundaries of how our emotions usually express themselves, we won't really know where we're headed and we won't know what to practice in order to get there. So I really felt that this year, the fact that I'd practiced regularly for the last however many years really gave me the platform and the foundation to have faith in yoga at this most difficult of times. And actually what I was rewarded with was a practice that helped to allow me the space to digest, to understand, but also to step back from some of the difficult and dark days that have been experienced this year. There are a few perspectives that I'd like to share from the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, which I found particularly beneficial this year for dealing with grief and dealing with the shock of someone so close, passing in such tragic and violent circumstances. The first one is to know ourselves as awareness. To know ourselves as awareness, what the Yoga Sutras calls Purusha. The Yoga Sutras says that at our very center there is awareness, and that this awareness is unchanging, and in addition to the awareness being unchanging, it is unaffected by the things that go on around us, even though it is the experiencer of those things. That is to say that part of yoga practice, if not the deepest part of yoga practice, is not just to know ourselves as body and as mind and as thoughts and as emotions, but also to know ourselves as unchanging awareness, an awareness that is uncontaminated by the movements and the circumstances of the world. Through our practice, as we begin to identify more and more fully with the fact that we are this unchanging awareness, it gives us a place to stand in our lives that is enabled to detach and to step back from the challenges. So for example, this year when I felt completely overwhelmed, I would remind myself that although I am experiencing this, although it is tragic, although it has been unfathomably difficult, at the same time I am unchanging awareness, and that awareness is unaffected by everything that goes in front of it. Even though that doesn't numb us to the challenges and to the suffering, which it shouldn't, even just knowing that that place is there and being able to call upon it and to ground ourselves into this unchanging awareness, this loving awareness, has really helped me to navigate some of the tough times, even perhaps by bringing the level of suffering down by 10%, let's say, at times. It has given me a place to be more balanced and to sustain myself and to sustain my energy as I've moved through the challenges of this year. The other thing that it says in the Yoga Sutras is that mainly we suffer because of expectation of how things should be in our lives. And as a result of having these expectations of how things should be in our lives, we suffer. So again, I found that in these circumstances, I've really challenged myself to say, well, okay, I expected life to go this way, but the reality of the situation is that that has not come to pass. Although that is tragic, although we wouldn't wish these situations into being, the reality is that this is where we are. If I can practice letting go of my expectations that things should be different and find an acceptance of what has happened, even though this may take years emotionally and psychologically to get over at the deepest level, because grief is not something that needs to happen or should happen quickly. It is an evolving, lifelong process, we could say, for any type of grief. Then perhaps if I can let go of those expectations, I can not resist the reality of what has happened. And as a result of not being in resistance to what has happened, I can flow with it more fully. I can feel it more fully because I'm no longer trying to resist it. And again, I found that this yogic wisdom of letting go of expectations and accepting the true nature of this world, which is change. The fact is that anything that we think is permanent, that is an illusion. Yoga tells us this very, very clearly, that the world of nature, the world of Prakriti, is subject to constant flux and change. And sadly, yet, in reality, this is another change that has occurred. Again, it may not be something that we wished for, it may not be something that we want, but at the same time, if we let go of expectations and we accept that life is full of change, it gives us a small platform to stand on, which allows us to move into a place of more acceptance of the reality of whatever we are facing in our lives. This brings me on to the practice of surrender, which is known as Ishvara Pranidhana in the Yoga Sutras. It encourages us, Patanjali says, the ultimate practice is surrendering to a higher power and essentially saying, not mine. Essentially what we are saying is that, or what we are trying to understand and what we are trying to feel is, I'm not in control. I'm never in control. And no matter how much I try to think I'm in control, it is also an illusion. The vast array of circumstances that come together in the external world and within us to cause the reality that we experience is well beyond the means of our control. If we can let go of the feeling that we must try to control everything, and if we can surrender into the fact that we actually control nothing, and surrender in a way that is not fear-based, but surrender into a place that allows us to be at peace, then actually this is something that can help us in our day-to-day lives. So when I think again about everything that has happened this year, if I can surrender into the reality of what has happened and say, okay, this has happened, there is nothing I can do to change it. And perhaps if we change channels slightly, we can look at it from a different way and say, well, I don't really know why this has happened. I can't comprehend with my limited mind. Perhaps there is some divine reason why this has happened that I can't comprehend. And may I have faith in the way that this is unfolding. And may I have faith that it will bring benefit to all the people that it's meant to bring benefit to, even though if I look at it with a rational mind based in the world of this reality, it may seem like an abhorrent thing to have happened. And of course, on this level, it is an abhorrent thing to have happened, and no one would wish for any of our friends to be murdered or to die in this way. But at the same time, it has happened, and so therefore what potentially advises us to do in all situations in life is to hand it over, is to surrender to the higher power, and to see if we can take a slightly different perspective on it, realizing that we can't control things, and seeing if we can find a deep acceptance of what has happened in our lives. And as a result of this, we don't push that situation away. As a result of this, what we do is we can actually look at life as a teacher, as a guide, and we can say, okay, this tragic thing has happened, but what can I learn from it? How can I grow in this life, through my own life? How do I use her message that she gave through the way that she lived into my own life? And how do I try to spread that energy into the world today? Because of course, as we know, the world needs peaceful, loving, compassionate energy more than ever before. So as I said, I know I don't often share quite this deeply, but I felt as my first video that I've recorded since her passing, since her death, I wanted to do something that honoured her passing, that honoured her death, but also that used it as a way which I'm sure she would be approving of showing how this deep and ancient wisdom of yoga can help us navigate challenging times in the most challenging of times. And as I often say in my classes, yoga is the practice of putting everything on the table. And what I mean by that is that we don't just use yoga for the easy things. We try to develop our capacity to practice yoga so that when the truly difficult things happen in our life, there it is. And we use its perspectives, we use its practice in order to help us navigate, in order to help us balance, and in order to help us meet the reality of what unfolds with equanimity and with deep, deep surrender. So I hope that in some way you have found this video useful today, and I hope to begin recording more videos again soon. Thank you for watching. Namaste.